Welcome to the latest episode of the Informing Choices mini-pod. In 2019, the BBC said there were two kinds of fake news. Firstly, false stories that are deliberately published and distributed in order to make people believe something untrue or to make people take a particular course of action. These are deliberate lies that are published predominantly online, even though the person writing them knows that they're untrue. Secondly, stories that may have some truth to them, but they're not completely accurate. This might be because the people writing them, for example, journalists or bloggers, don't check all of the facts before publishing the story. But there might also be a third category, where people believe something to be true and share the information within their network, in case it's helpful. Although the idea of fake news found momentum with former President Donald Trump, we have seen further damaging and dangerous examples during the COVID-19 pandemic. Fake news can be harmless, annoying, dangerous, or deadly. So with this backdrop, what is the future of fake news? To consider this question, I'm delighted to welcome back PR consultant Islay to the podcast. Islay, welcome back. Remind us a little bit about you and your business, what you do.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you for welcoming me back. I'm delighted to be here. As you said, I'm a PR consultant. I specialize in helping individuals and businesses build visibility and influence and trust in the marketplace. And I do that in terms of thought leadership and personal branding. So the whole issue of fake news is something that is very close to my heart and something I'm particularly interested in.
Well, excellent. So when we talk about fake news, how is it generated and distributed, both maliciously and by accident? What are the main channels that we see?
I think before I tackle that question, I just want to clarify what we mean by the term fake news. It's interesting that in your introduction, you've taken some information from the BBC in 2019. And we all know in the world of communication, particularly post-pandemic, that things move so fast. And fake news is an area that is moving and changing exponentially almost daily. And one of the areas in which it's changing is that there is a move away from using the term fake news. There's a variety of reasons for this. One is that internationally, the term fake news isn't that well understood. And the other, you alluded to this in your introduction, is that Donald Trump basically weaponized the term fake news and used it to undermine the news media. So there is a move now in the PR and the journalism world to break the term down slightly differently from the way that you described in your introduction. The terms that we're using now are disinformation. And this is information that is falsely and deliberately created to harm a person, social group, organization, or country. The second term is misinformation. That's information that's false, but not created with the intention of causing harm. And the third category is information that is based on reality, and it is used to inflict harm on a person, social group, organization, or country. So the terminology I'm noticing from what you said and what I've just said is about the intention behind the content, the purpose. And as we all know, communication is absolutely rooted in purpose. So coming back to your question, how is fake news generated, distributed, both maliciously and by accident? I think there are four main ways, I think, really. Yes, of course, it's through social media and through our technology platforms. And the first way really is through the bots. The bots are consciously crawling, looking for information, and they have the capability to search and retrieve this information and to share it. And they do it so quickly.
Yeah.
The second main way this fake news is or misinformation and disinformation is shared is obviously by ourselves, by people. And there's a variety of motivations behind that. It could be purposefully, could be simply unintentionally, or simply out of, we're sharing information because we think perhaps we ought to. You know, we're all drawn to information from people we trust, and we think that maybe, you know, if we're sharing that information on because we feel we ought to, or it's a good idea, so we can be doing it intentionally or unintentionally. And also the cookies, you know, the micro targeting on the computer. Now, these are so complex now. They know what we're looking at, they know what we're sharing, and they're using that to give us more of the information, perhaps, that we do or that we don't want to see. So they're exploiting that. And then, of course, we have trolls, who are people who are setting up social media accounts with the sole purpose of sharing and distributing disinformation. So I think those are the four key areas about how news is generated and distributed.
It's fascinating as you were going through those. The link across all of them is how the technology to support those activities kind of creates the ability in an exponential way. It's much easier to provide disinformation and even misinformation, as particularly as we've seen during the pandemic, as I mentioned earlier on. All good intentions, but if the underlying information is false or harmful in some way, then, you know, there's nothing to stop it, is there?
Not at all. And of course, the information is designed to be highly shareable. And I think that in our world, the global communication system, I think, does have something to answer for, in the sense that it values content performance over content quality. I know we're slightly going off at a tangent here, but, you know, I think that whilst we are constantly monitoring the performance of the content that we're putting out there in terms of attention, user engagement, click-through rates, you know, and user engagement and social sharing statistics, you know, all of this feeds into the speed at which news is shared, because as humans, we are drawn to content that has a high number of likes or a high number of comments. You know, we think that this is somehow validation, and because we're so busy and we're in a world of information overload, perhaps we don't take that moment to step back and look at the source and read it, perhaps what we're sharing properly.
Hopefully we'll come back to the issue of motivation as to why misinformation or disinformation comes around, because I think the motivation piece is really interesting, and it may be that we get into that with my next question, which is, what do we know about who is doing this? I mean, you've talked a little bit about where it might be coming from, but by who, I mean, you know, state actors, corporates, individuals with malicious intent. You know, whereabouts does this come from? Who's doing it and why?
There's a variety of people that are doing it, and you alluded to the BBC earlier, and they've broadly categorized people who are sharing misinformation into 7 categories. I mean, as we've alluded to, we have the deliberate pranksters, you know, the people who are deliberately sharing something to see what will happen. You know, we have the scammers. You know, we've all probably received scams. This is information that looks as if it's coming from the local government or the local council. And I do just have to say that all of these have accelerated during the COVID pandemic, you know, and I think that, you know, politicians, we've alluded to Donald Trump. I think we all remember him standing up there talking about bleach as a potential cure. But, you know, he's not the only politician who's taken facts out of context. So again, it comes back down to the purpose. You know, what is the purpose? And then, of course, we've got deliberate conspiracy theorists. One running last year that people may remember was that 5G was linked to causing coronavirus. And this spread to the extent that people were damaging telephone masks, and the government actually had to step in and counter that. We've got what's termed as the insider. This is somebody who is a respected person. Maybe you perceive them to have insider knowledge, such maybe as an ambulance driver. There were some stories last year. Again, you know, if we think back, we can probably come up with all sorts, but these are a trustworthy source that, again, potentially has taken facts out of context. Our relatives or friends passing something on because they think that it's important information that needs sharing. And then I think the last category really is celebrities.
Oh, yes.
And who maybe are sharing information, perhaps, I might be slightly being a little bit contentious, but perhaps without having regard for what the impact of what they're sharing is going to have on their millions of followers. The fact that they have a responsibility, they're seen as Yeah, person of influence.
I suppose I was just thinking as you were talking about, they're almost like an upside down pyramid, aren't they, in the way that their networks work, and they influence potentially millions of people.
Yeah.
I want to go back to something else that you said earlier on, and not particularly struck me before, but when you were talking about politicians' use of misinformation, is that kind of spin that's been automated almost? Because I suppose over the 90s particularly, we got used to political spin and thinking about spin doctors in positions of supporting major political leaders. So has spin become automated to some extent and fed into this whole piece of misinformation, disinformation, and so on?
That's a very interesting question. And I don't think it has, but it's interesting in the sense of coming back to that purpose. And I think that's where the difference lies. And it would be useful to have a further sort of maybe deeper analysis of this, because, in terms of political communications and what we've seen over the last 2 years, particularly with COVID, and I'm referring back to the US presidential election and the accusations made against the Soviet Union in terms of what they were putting through. And they weren't necessarily using politicians. Their way of influencing the political agenda was via social media, which then forced politicians to then respond to that. So it's almost the direction the communication is coming from, the purpose behind it. I think that's an interesting question. That's one to ponder further, I believe.
We've spoken then about the whole political piece, and we touched a little bit then on the celebrity. So when we then think about how some of these issues might evolve into the future, particularly from a technology perspective, what role might existing and perhaps even newer technologies play in the future in perpetrating more disinformation or misinformation? And how might technology help in terms of identifying, potentially tagging that kind of information, and ideally, I suppose, even preventing it?
Okay, big question. I think that there is no doubt that misinformation and disinformation is a growing problem. I think we are all aware of that, and there is a growing awareness and a growing sense of urgency that it needs to be tackled. So these are all positives, and there is a growing awareness that this needs to be tackled on multiple levels. It can't just be one person. It has to be ourselves. It has to be tech giants. It has to be governments. It has to be the media and communications industry. But I think the root of this question almost goes back into why fake news is spreading so quickly. And actually the simple fact that the content is designed to spread rapidly. It's highly shareable. Well, it takes time for a human or AI to look at that content and decide whether it's truthful or not. That takes time, but the speed at which it's generated is faster than humans or AI can debunk it. Now, having said that, the rise and the motivations behind developing AI to help debunk stories it is phenomenal. The growth in technology and the advances that have been made in terms of processing such an enormous amount of data, way faster than humans can ever do.
Yeah.
That can only help prevent the sharing of social media, of misinformation. And I think one of the benefits, or one of the outputs or outcomes, if you like, of the pandemic is that all of the major platforms have really accelerated what they're doing to help alert people, because that's a key thing too. We need to know that what we're looking at may or may not be true. And a classic example of this is Twitter last year with Donald Trump making increasingly use of the little tag that they used to put on the tweets from Donald Trump to say that this might be misleading content, to the point at which they actually took off his account. So the social media platforms are doing more tagging. They are taking more responsibility to take down malicious or damaging content. But there is always this delay from when they see the content to proving that it's wrong, because of course we can't be in a world where information is taken down without having that authoritative fact checking, because we're in the realms of censorship. So there's always going to be that, that balance, and there is a time factor. And I do think, to answer your question, is that the identifying and the tagging is getting better all the time. I think that we do have to know and be helped by these platforms that what we're looking at might not be true. And I think enormous strides are being made in that. And I welcome the growth of organizations such as Full Fact, the fact check service created by Channel 4, and that there are others where we can go and we can look ourselves to make sure. Yeah. But I think preventing it, I don't actually know. I think that is incredibly difficult. I don't know that you can prevent it. I think we have to get faster at identifying it, debunking it. Yeah, I think we have to just get faster at that. And I think that's where technology has such a valuable role to play.
It feels like there's kind of, to use an old phrase, a sort of a war of words between the kind of the fact check, the reality, and the mis and disinformation. And the other thing I'm just kind of reflecting on is, I suppose, the tension between eradicating falsehoods that might be malicious against the notion of freedom of speech. I suppose there's also something you alluded to, it was kind of my spin of this, was the need for education somewhere about how we might start to recognize misinformation. And I suppose the other thing that we need to bear in mind is that I'm sure the mindset that we've been using to talk about this has been from a Western democracy perspective. So freedom of speech is normal, freedom of speech is expected, it's allowed by governments. But what about the power of non-democratic authorities? So how might the Chinese consider this? What information might the Russians, that you've already mentioned, push out into the public domain, where democracy and freedom of speech is less well regarded? And how do we then kind of filter that into the idea of mis and disinformation, and what do we do with it? And I know there are no really good answers there either.
They're not. I think it's always going to be rooted. I mean, we've had, there's nothing new about propaganda, and I think, we've had this, ever since people have been communicating, and it comes back to that purpose of why are you communicating? I mean, it's such a complex issue, but really, without going too much back into the ethics of it, I think that, it does come down to that purpose, that ethical. And I think that the ethical communication now, the reason why you're communicating, particularly for businesses who, if they get embroiled in disinformation, the reputational damage can be phenomenal. So I think that in this time where we are looking at where we are, I mean, I think you're right. It comes down to the fact that we have to question what we're looking at. We have to not be overwhelmed with the information overload. We do have to look at what we're reading, take a moment to pause, to reflect, to look at what we're reading. Should we share it? Because when we share it, we are taking an action. We have a responsibility. And I think that too is where we're heading, is, what responsibility do the tech companies, the social media platforms, what governments, what responsibility should be almost levied on them or judged on them in terms of a punishment for putting out something that is deliberately misleading?
So is there a role, do you think, in the future for some kind of different regulatory framework to protect the public? Is there something that government can impose upon tech companies, as well as encouraging us? I mean, I really like that thing you just said, should we share it? So we should be asking ourselves. So that's about our behavior in all of this thing. But is there something around regulatory frameworks that might be done between government and tech companies even more to protect people in the future?
I have been seeing a definite growing consensus on the need to take action against disinformation, regardless of the source of intent. And I think that, we've spoken, there is a lot that's being done, both by, the tech companies who are taking action against harmful and malicious content. And I think that that is set to grow. I think that is not only, and I think in a way that that's being driven by their sense of responsibility, but also as us as consumers. We don't want to be duped. We don't want to be misled. So we're pushing, we're driving the tech companies to try to take responsibility. I think that we must ensure we have a responsibility, as PR professionals and, and in the media, we do have a responsibility to ensure the public and the media have the means to distinguish between true news and disinformation. And as I've said, that we resist that urge to amplify further, and we take responsibility for fact checking. Yeah. And I think in terms of regulatory frameworks, I think they will come. I think they have to. Now, whether that is a regulatory framework, whether code of conducts will change. I know codes of conduct are changing across, certainly in journalism, certainly in PR. They are all changing to take account of disinformation and independent regulation. And I think that has to come for the tech companies too. I think it can't work in isolation. And I know governments are looking at this. I know the UK government certainly is. The Digital Culture, Media and Sport Committee have been producing guidelines and reports, have been very active in this area. But I think we can't leave it to regulatory frameworks and ethical codes of conduct. We can't leave it to somebody else, I don't feel. I think that we do have to have a personal responsibility to the people that are going to read the content that we share. We all have networks. We might not have the millions of networks that celebrities have, but I think that we should start to take on a responsibility for what we share and make sure that we're not part of the problem. It's easier said than done, I appreciate.
Yeah, one of the thoughts that popped into my head is, how do you create regulatory frameworks around the world that are free of political interference? Yeah. And that's the trick, because I guess if you were to count the number of countries where you would feel confident that a regulatory framework would be free of political interference, it would actually be a very small number. I mean, would you guarantee that would be true even in Poland and Hungary?
Absolutely. And you've got to make sure that you aren't, it comes back to, social media is a hugely powerful tool for good. Yeah. And we've seen that in the pandemic. Information that needs to get from a government to the populace at speed, that is the way that it's done. So you've got to have, can you have one without the other? Can you have a regulatory framework that solely looks at misinformation and disinformation without harming that need to spread accurate information as quickly as possible? Can the two exist, together? And I think that this is an interesting time that we're living in, because this is, it's a huge debate. And I think then, does it come back to the fact that we're raising awareness of the identification of fake news? Is that where it's going to lie? Because I think you're right. Are we ever going to have a global framework that everybody signs up to? I'm not so sure, because we're dealing with information that spreads across the world in seconds. I think that the future is by no means bleak. I think that there is that intention to do something about it, about the spread of misinformation and disinformation, and that can only be a good thing. And I think that as the pursuit of fighting fake news becomes more sophisticated, technology leaders will continue to work to find even better ways to sort out fact from fiction, also as well as refine the AI tools that can help fight disinformation.
Yeah, the thought that's going through my mind is, at the moment, is that just before we started recording the podcast, we were talking about how big, how broad, how massive this particular topic is. And I think all we've really done is opened up more questions. But I think that notion of how do we balance those challenges with the opportunities of channels like social media might be, given the time, a really good way to end the conversation. Islay, thank you so much once again for your time. That's been absolutely fascinating. Remind us, how can people contact you, find you online to learn more about what you do?
People can contact me through Twitter at Islay O, or on LinkedIn at Islay OHara. I'm more than happy for people to contact me and to continue the conversation.
Islay, once again, thank you so much for your time. And thank you everyone for listening. Do let your friends and colleagues know about the Informing Choices mini pod, and I'll see you on a future episode very soon.